Today's lesson is going to be on abrasives. Abrasives, fancy word for sandpaper, is what you're going to be using to prepare the wood for finishing. Sanding is really the first step in the finishing process. If you do not do a good job at sanding, there's no way you're going to have a nice finish. Most people don't enjoy sanding. It's kind of boring work, but you need to do it, and you need to do it well so that your finish comes out nice. You could do an expert job on all your joinery and everything else, but if you rush through the sanding, your project is going to come out looking horrible because the finish is lousy. So really pay attention to, a good sanding job. So sand for two reasons. If we're following along on the handout that we provided, right? One is grinding and shaping. So for example, if I had cut something out on the bandsaw and I had cut and left the line, I would use a belt sander or something really aggressive to grind the wood down to my line so that I have a nice clean surface. Okay? That's one purpose for sanding. But mostly what we're going to focus on today is the second purpose of sanding, which is preparing for a finish, where we're taking off very little wood, just refining the surface so that it's perfect and ready for a finish. Okay? So with that in mind, the first question you ask is, well, what surfaces do I need to sand? Well, we're talking about our table here that we're going to be making. We want to sand the surfaces you're going to see. So on the aprons, for example, I'm going to see the outside, so I'm going to sand this outside surface, and then the bottom I don't really see it unless I'm laying on the floor, but I'm going to sand that too because it is visible. The inside, the back, I'm not going to see that. That's inside the table. You're not going to be looking there, so I'm not even going to bother with that. And I'm definitely not going to sand the joints. Do not sand a joint. If the joint doesn't fit, you want to use a cutting tool or go back to the saw and recut it, or maybe a chisel to shave it down. But sanding is not a very accurate method of taking material off, and what it tends to do is round it over. It makes it smoother, which is going to make it harder for the glue to hold it together because the glue is what holds the whole thing together, and it leaves sawdust behind. So there's lots of reasons why you don't want to sand to get a joint to fit right. So if it's not fitting right, there are lots of tools we can use to recut the joint and bring it down to the right size, but don't use sandpaper. Okay? So any visible surface needs to be sanded. Well, what are we trying to remove? And we're going to see if we can see this with the camera, but there are imperfections. So this went through the planer, and see this line right here? That is a slight nick in the knife in the planer, and it left a little bit of a ridge. You might see a line going across here and here, and that may have been where the board just paused for a second in the planer, and it left a little bit of a mark. Also, very often you'll see it looks like little waves in the board, and it has to do with each cut of the knife as it goes by. So all of these imperfections, you can hardly see them. Sometimes you have to get the board just at the right angle to even see them at all. But when you put finish on them, they're going to be like trumpets blaring. They're going to be right in your face. So you really need to get it as perfect as you can now, because the finish, one of the purposes of the finish is to amplify all the fine detail in the wood so it looks pretty. But it's going to also amplify all the little problems in the board, and you want to get those gone with the sanding. So it's important. Even though it looks kind of smooth, it definitely needs some sanding. Okay? Now let's talk about sandpaper for a minute. Sandpaper, what's sandpaper? It's paper with sand glued to it, right? And the sand can be different kinds of stuff, different kinds of minerals or material. Years ago, they used to use a material called flint, which didn't hold up well and was not very successful, but it was inexpensive. That kind of never got purchased because it really became just not a good quality material. But garnet was popular. Garnet is a mineral that you can find in the ground. It's a rock that can get crushed up. Now, there is jewelry and gems made out of garnet, but not all the garnet that's mined is usable for jewelry. A lot of it just becomes abrasive for sandpaper, right? And you can see this is a piece of garnet right here. And it's a natural mineral. It's found in the ground, crushed up into sand. The sand is sifted into sizes. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then glued to paper or cloth for abrasive paper. And if you could look really close at this, all this is sand glued to the paper. Okay? And that's what this is. So, and it's got a reddish color to it. So garnet, you can tell because of its reddish color. It's a decent abrasive, and if you look on the handout that we gave you, it's garnet. It's a natural. Its origin is natural. It's found in the ground. It's got a reddish color. The quality of it, it's hard but not very tough. Ever have a rock when you were a kid playing with rocks and you find rocks that would fracture along a surface and make sharp edges? Well, that's kind of what happens with garnet when it fractures. It leaves little sharp edges that make it really good for sandpaper, so it can cut away at the wood and refine the surface. The problem is it fractures fairly easy, so it's good for hand sanding, but if you were to put it like on a belt sander belt, it just wouldn't hold up. It would wear down too quickly. So it's good for hand sanding or for vibrating type sanders that vibrate, but anything that spins or is on a belt, it's just not going to hold up. So they tend to see this used just for hand sanding, okay? And under uses it says that, okay? The next abrasive is very popular. It's called aluminum oxide. Now this sheet right here is what aluminum oxide really looks like. It's got a brown color. It's very, very hard. It's a very tough abrasive, and it's very popular on belt sander belts and disc sander discs. So it can really take a beating. In fact, you can even sand metal with it. If we went into the metal shop and looked on their belt sanders in the metal shop where they actually grind the metal with a belt sander, that's aluminum oxide belt on there, okay? Now, aluminum oxide, when you look at it, is brown like this. But usually when you buy it, it looks like this. Well, why is it a different color? Well, this aluminum oxide has a coating on it. It's called a stearate coating. And they tend to use this a lot with aluminum oxide belts and paper. And it's a material that causes like a release so that it doesn't hold the wood as badly. So they call it, usually you'll see it advertised as no clog or clog free or something like that, where it's less likely to clog up than regular untreated sandpaper. So when you see stearated coated sandpaper, it's usually got some kind of stearate on there that it's like a soap that allows the material to fall out, and it clogs less. It's not going to not clog, but it clogs a lot less than if it doesn't have it on at all. So you can't quite go by the color on aluminum oxide, but you'll find that most abrasives that you're going to find in the store are probably aluminum oxide. It would probably say it on the package as well, right? Again, if you look at our sheet, we have it's a synthetic abrasive. In other words, you can't mine aluminum oxide out of the ground. It's man-made. Don't ask me how they make it, but they make it in a lab, I imagine, or at a factory. But it's an abrasive that's manufactured. It's got a light brown color if it doesn't have a coating on it. It's very, very tough. Like we said, you can use it to sand metals, and you find it on, you can sand it for wood. It's good to sand wood and metal with, and you'll find it on belt sanders, disc sanders, and you could again use it for hand sanding, just like you can garnet, right? So if you have a choice between garnet and aluminum oxide, I'd probably get aluminum oxide every time because it's more versatile. Okay, so that's aluminum oxide. Now this black stuff is the next one we have here. This is another man-made abrasive. It's called silicon carbide. And they use it for the superfine abrasives. This stuff is so fine that I would not sand bare wood with it. It's not made for that because it's so fine it would clog up immediately and be useless. So what would you use it for? Well, it's for sanding the finish. Ever hear of a hand-rubbed finish? So after they put several coats of lacquer or polyurethane or varnish or something on there, they'll take this abrasive, silicon carbide, and sand it wet. Now, the reason they sand it wet is the liquid, whether it's water or oil, keeps the paper from clogging, but you're sanding that layer of finish and you're getting the imperfections out of the surface of the finish. You're not sanding down to where the wood is. So don't try to sand with silicon carbide on your bare wood. It's a waste of time. Right? In fact, it will cause problems because you can actually sand too fine. If you start to sand with too fine of an abrasive, you tend to polish the wood and it starts to seal up in places, and then when you go to put your finish on, it soaks in a blotchy pattern and it doesn't look nice at all. So you can over sand. So don't sand with silicon carbide because that's a superfine abrasive on your bare wood. It's for sanding a finish. Okay? And again, on the handout, we have it listed, silicon carbide. It's a synthetic abrasive. It's black in color. It's very hard, and it's a superfine abrasive used for wet sanding finishes. Okay? So, now, how do you tell how coarse or fine the sandpaper is? Well, that's with grit numbers. And on the back of the sandpaper are usually numbers. Like, for example, this is a 220 grit sandpaper. The letter has to do with the backing. An A backing is a paper backing. There are cloth backings, different weights, and we're not going to worry about that. But the number tells you the grit of the abrasive. So that happens to be some 220. This is 320. Again, ignore the letter in the front. It has to do with a European system that's almost exactly the same as ours, but you have a P in front of it. You can see these are higher numbers, 600 and 1,000 grit. But the higher the number, the finer the paper is, the smoother it is. The lower the number, the rougher the paper is. So when you sand something, you want to start off with a rough enough sandpaper to get out the imperfections, and then work your way up until you get to a fine paper, fine enough so that when you put the finish on, it looks nice. Okay? So and then there are some papers that are coarse enough that they will actually grind. So for example, our belt sander in the back of the room has like a 40 or 60 grit abrasive on it. That's for grinding. That's for really hogging off a lot of material, shaping my curve down to where I want to or whatever. But for a normal sanding job, you're going to want to sand with 100, then 150, and 220 grits sandpaper. 100 grit, 150 grit, 220 grit. 100 is coarse enough. It's considered a medium grit sandpaper. If you want it to go medium fine and extra fine, it's considered a medium. And it's enough to take out those imperfections, but you're not really leaving major scratches in the wood. There are some scratches that it will leave behind, but not so bad that you can't get them out with the next grit. So then the 150, and you want to do all the work with the first step, by the way. You want to use the 100 grit to get out all those little imperfections we were talking about before we had in here, like that little ridge from the nick knife, these little waves. I want to get all that out with the 100. Don't stop sanding with the 100 until those are gone. If you say, well, I'll get it out with the next grit, you're going to be there forever, because the next grit just isn't aggressive enough, and it'll take you forever. So get all the scratches out with the 100. The only thing that should be left on the wood is the scratches that the 100 made. Then go to the 150, and that will take out the scratches from the 100, and then finish off at the 220, which will take out scratches from the 150. Now, we're assuming at this point that you're using a sander. We'll talk about sanders in a minute. If you're sanding by hand, just hand sanding, you really only have to do 100 and 150 grit sandpaper, because you're sanding with the grain and there are no other marks. The sander actually goes in a circular pattern, so you have to go fine enough to kind of hide that circular pattern. So sanding by hand with 100, 150 is good enough, and you can stop at 150 and it'll be just fine. But normally we sand with a sander, so 100, 150, 220 when you're sanding with a sander. Again, on our little handout, we're talking about the different grits. The coarse grits, the 40s and 60s, is for grinding and shaping. Again, you see those on heavy belt sanders. Then we're going to do medium, fine, and extra fine with preparing for a finish. And by the way, other woodworkers may use a slightly different combination of numbers. We use 100, 150, 220. Some people may use 80, 120, 180. It's the same thing. They're still going from a medium to a fine to an extra fine. But as far as my classes are concerned, I'm teaching you to use 100, 150, 220. That works out really nice. All right? And again, down here I have the order listed here, and the note about hand sanding, you can stop at 150. Now, before we get off onto the sanding machines and everything, I want to mention one other thing. There is another abrasive that you may come across in your woodworking travels, and that's steel wool. Steel wool looks like a Brillo pad like your mother might use to scrub the pots and pans at home, but it doesn't have any soap in it. It's just a wire pad, real fine wire bristles. And it comes in grits just like sandpaper does. In fact, if you look at the package on this one, it's showing you that it goes from 4.0 to 3.0, 2.0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 being the coarsest, 4.0 is the finest. Now here's a piece of 4.0 steel wool, and then in this package here we can see some, let's see, what is this? This is, this is kind of in the middle. So I think even on the camera you can see the difference between the 4.0 and the O, and you can imagine how coarse a 4 would be. Now, lots of times I like to use the 4.0 steel wool. After I do all my sanding, I put on a finish, and I want to put a nice little coat of paste wax on. I put the paste wax on with the 4.0 steel wool, and that takes off any slight imperfections in the finish. And at the same time, I'm applying wax, so it's kind of a nice little trick. But sometimes we use steel wool in woodworking, so I just figured I'd mention this, that there is a system with steel wool on how coarse or fine that is as well. So put that aside. In our next segment, we're going to talk about the different kinds of sanders.